My name is Teresa Larrabee. I'm an intern at P1, and part of my internship for my graduate program was putting together a presentation and training on cultural competency.
And my name is Angela Fredrickson. I'm the clinical director. I'm also out at Northwest Passage 1. If you're watching this, you're likely either a new employee or an employee that really needs to get their clock hours for their training for the year done. And cultural competency, diversity is one of those required trainings. So we hope to give you things to think about. We're not going to give you a lot of specific information today about, tons of different sort of groups and cultures and experiences, but what we're trying to do is to give you a framework for sort of how to think about the world and how to work with the kids that are here at Northwest Passage, but also your coworkers.
Yes. So what is cultural competency and why do we learn it? We work with a diverse population of clients from many different cultures, ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds. We have coworkers from the same set of diverse backgrounds. And when understanding factors of a person, we stand to better serve them and improve health outcomes when we take into account cultural competency. And cultural competence is fundamental to providing quality services that promote individual and family strengths, dignity, and self-reliance.
I think the important thing to remember is that even though Northwest Passage is located in a pretty homogeneous culture area, increasingly we are getting employees from all over the United States, and we're getting kids not only from the Midwest, from Wisconsin, Minnesota, but from all over. And by all over, I'm increasingly meaning the entire world, because we work with many kids who have joined families as a result of international adoption. So this topic of cultural competency and understanding diversity is more relevant than ever for your job at Northwest Passage.
So culture, if we define culture, it is a combination of behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, actions, and values of groups. These groups may be defined by their race, religion, ethnicity, or social affinity.
Right, so a big definition. And like I said, we're not going to go through understanding all of these things, like race and religion and ethnicity and social affinity and socioeconomic status and all of these really big topics. Instead, what we're trying to do today is give you a way to think about it.
So this is part of what my project involved, was assessing the whole Northwest Passage organization on cultural competence. And what we're looking for is to increase, when groups function efficiently, they're deemed competent. Pairing of the words culture and competence together mean that the system has put forth a successful effort in hiring, education, assessment, and intervention strategies, and a continued effort to work towards improvement in the provision of services that take into account one's cultural needs.
And a big part of that is this training.
Absolutely. So why is cultural competency important? It is vital for an organization to be culturally competent so that clients can best be served. Policies and practice that acknowledge a person and environment and the entire biopsychosocial makeup of the client increases the likelihood of a comprehensive intervention and promotes ethical practice. And continuous dialogue and education, such as this training, need to occur at all levels of an organization to improve health outcomes.
So a lot of information there in this slide, but part of what I wanted to talk about a little bit is that it brings the real into this discussion. Mm-hmm. Really, Northwest Passage is focused on really understanding that the kids that we work with don't just pop up out of the ground and just appear. They have a social construct that they came from. They all have different experiences. And we need to take those into account, because really it is about making our clients feel like they have gotten served well. And part of that is helping them to trust us. And part of having them trust us is them having a feeling that we truly understand where they're coming from. And if we don't understand, we know that we don't understand. I think that's a big piece. It's not just about knowing everything. It's about having curiosity. It's about understanding that we don't know everything about a person's sort of background and the lens that they're viewing the world through. Now, I've talked a lot about kids and the kids that we work with. This is important for our coworkers too. I think the thing that Teresa does a really great job at constantly reminding me is that even though I might look the same as someone, or maybe even come from the same area as someone else, geographically, I guess, it doesn't mean that they have the same experience that I do. That diversity can be housed in very similar looking boxes, I guess,
Exactly.
or packages.
Yeah. So this is just a graphic to show that our communication increases client satisfaction, adherence, and overall improves health outcomes when we consider cultural competence of our clients and their families.
Right, so for culturally competent, that affects our communication, and then our communication is improved, increased, expanded, which helps clients feel more satisfied with the services that they're getting. If a client feels, or the kiddos that we're working with, or the families that we're working with are satisfied, this whole idea of customer satisfaction, what it means in the mental health world is that if they feel like that they were heard and that they were recognized as a human being, it's going to be so much more likely that they're going to show this thing called adherence, which means they're going to listen to our recommendations, which means they're going to follow our suggestions, which means hopefully that they're going to live lives with less pain than when they came to Northwest Passage in the first place, which speaks to the health outcomes.
So how do we become culturally competent? Angela's put together some steps that we're going to go through a little more in depth. And these are the steps: the awareness, acceptance of the existence of diversity, understanding the effects of assumptions, self-awareness, knowledge of other cultures, interacting with others with a working knowledge of yourself and others.
All right. So we're just going to go through each of these separately and talk about them very briefly. And I wanted to start out with this great TED Talk that I found on YouTube. I guess that's where everything good comes from, I suppose. So we'll start this, I'll play it, and then I'll talk about it a little bit at the end.
So imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block? And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street. This is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? And you say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, easy. This is District 8. There's block 17, house number 1. You say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. He said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy. It's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had, and realize that the opposite of them may also be true. So for example, there are doctors in China who believe that it's their job to keep you healthy. So any month you are healthy, you pay them. And when you're sick, you don't have to pay them because they failed at their job. They get rich when you're healthy, not sick. In most music, we think of the 1 as the downbeat, the beginning of the musical phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4. But in West African music, the 1 is thought of as the end of the phrase, like the period at the end of a sentence. So you can hear it not just in the phrasing, but the way they count off their music. 2, 3, 4, 1. And this map is also accurate. There's a saying that whatever true thing you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So let's never forget, whether at TED or anywhere else, that whatever brilliant ideas you have or hear, that the opposite may also be true. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
So there's so much that I like about that video. So we're talking about streets and blocks and the unnamed spaces in between, and also we're talking about the fact that you don't know what you don't know, right? And so the questioner there, when the Japanese man questioned the American man, and then when he turned the tables, they didn't know that they were asking a question from a sort of very ethnocentric kind of place. They had no idea that it would be thought of any different in a different country about street names versus block names. But what a great lesson that teaches us about that idea about awareness and assumptions. When we don't have awareness of the things that we don't know, which can seem a little redundant and weird, but if we don't have awareness that we don't know everything about another person's experience, then that leads to assumptions, and those assumptions shut down curiosity. And curiosity is the most important thing when we're talking about cultural competence and that understanding of diversity and how to navigate those things in the workplace. So step one is the awareness of diversity, right? Just being aware that there are differences all around us. So I wanted to, at the most basic, just talk about the definition of diversity, which is simply showing variety. And that can be applied to anything. It can be applied to concrete objects around you, as well as more complicated things like people. And when it's applied to people, it really helps to encompass things that make us different, but also things that make us the same. And these things like physical characteristics, psychological characteristics, values, beliefs. So you can see when you start to apply something like diversity to human beings, that can make it really difficult and complicated. So the awareness is the beginning of developing effective relationships with each other. So whether you're trying to figure out where your coworker is coming from when you're working with a kid, which there could be a lot of effects. The family that they grew up in, their sort of culture that they're rooted in, experiences that they've had. So it can go anywhere from there to understanding your shift partner to understanding where a kid is coming from. Again, whether that's their cultural basis, whether that's their family experience, whether that's their socioeconomic status, it could be so many things. And the biggest thing here, again, is being aware that there are things that we don't know, and that there are assumptions that we have, and we always have to be on the lookout for those assumptions. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about understanding what I'm saying when I say assumptions, right, and what that means. So these are statements that I've heard from staff in times of stress. These are statements that have also come out of my mouth as well. And I just thought it would make sense to at least look at these, because you are likely going to say some of these things. At some time you're going to hear your coworkers say some of these things. And what I really want you to do is think about it now when you're not in a time of stress. So the first one, he acts like a thug or a wannabe gangbanger. I've heard this so many times. So really think about what this is saying. I don't really know what this is saying. Is it worse to be a genuine gangbanger or a wannabe gangbanger? What is a thug? Is a thug the same as me as it is for you, Teresa? What are the sets of behaviors and statements that you would hear that would cause you to put the label of thug on a kid? And is it that the same as mine? And does that make a difference whether I grew up in New Jersey or I grew up in California? I don't know for sure.
What's the client's perception of what a thug is, or
exactly. A great example that we have of this right now is a young man who has been described as a thug numerous times by different staff members and his clinical team. It's sort of a shorthand so that we maybe understand what each other think, but maybe not. But I will have to say that someone said that he really puts the hug in thug. And it's a great thing to remember, because this may not be where they're coming from at all. This may be a coat or an identity that they're putting on because they need to protect what's underneath. And certainly for that kid that puts the hug in thug, he is pretty vulnerable. And this persona is his protection. And so then when we're thinking about diversity and cultural competence, what do we do with that then? Do we dismiss it by calling him a wannabe? Do we get frustrated because we know he's lying? Or do we come at it with curiosity and figure out what it is that he's protecting himself from and what he is protecting inside from the outside world? This one sort of sets my teeth on edge a little bit because I worked with girls for a long time in the Passage 3 program. That she's always so manipulative. And there are so many words in here that I really want to talk about. Always, really always, like when she's sleeping, like when she's in the bathroom, like when she's interacting with people, when she's talking with friends, like really always. And manipulative is a really important word as well. One of the things that I like to talk about or give examples about is that it's really hard to call it manipulation when you know what's going on, because the moment you have awareness that maybe she's putting forth information to get what she wants that might not be genuine, then it's not manipulation anymore. You know that, well, she's trying to get her needs met, not in a really healthy way. So you can see the difference sort of in that presentation.
I think there's such a negative connotation. So when I hear the word manipulation, I'm thinking about her behaviors in a negative light. So when I hear that statement, that's where my mind automatically goes, where Angela's might be different.
Exactly. That's just attention seeking. This one also sets my teeth on edge, but it's said all the time. I've said it. Mm-hmm. I've said it before. So I want to focus on two things. The just, right? So what does just do? Just minimizes maybe the person, or the action. Maybe just gives you a reason to discard it. And the attention-seeking piece is really important to pay attention to as well. We're all attention-seeking beings. It's how we form relationships. It's how we make attachments with our mothers when we're babies. My God, if we weren't attention-seeking as human beings, we would never form those most important bonds. The problem comes, of course, when this attention-seeking behavior sort of outstays its welcome, or it occurs in places that are inconvenient or frustrating. So I think that's important to think about that when you're using that phrase, because you will. I guarantee it. And the last one, he never cares what we say. He has an I don't care attitude. Yep, this happens. It's said, and it also happens with our kids, right? I think here's the important thing. I accidentally put a period at the end of that one. What I wanted to make sure that I did was not put any sort of ending on these statements, and I did it for a reason. Because what makes it an assumption is when we put a period at the end, okay? Because it stops all curiosity, it stops problem solving, it stops the conversation, actually, right? He acts like a thug, period, done, over. She's always so manipulative, period. Right? What would happen if we put a question mark at the end of these statements, right? That's just attention seeking? For me, that opens up sort of a road for questioning and curiosity and problem solving.
Further exploration,
right,
to why they're using these coping strategies or defense mechanisms.
Yep, absolutely. Now, we just focused sort of on kids' behaviors here with this, pretty much, and attitudes, but I think this can extend to all questions about diversity or the clashing of cultures when you find it on your shift. And just think about that. Are you putting a period at the end of your descriptions, or are you sometimes adding a question mark? Because I think that's important. So, of course, assumptions are going to happen. So my goal here is to not, and Teresa's goal for sure, is not to, we're not about eradicating assumption from the face of the planet. The thing is it can't be, because this is how our brains work. It's how our brains make sense of the world. In fact, if we didn't put things in categories, if our brain didn't put things in categories, we would become overwhelmed by information. It's how our brains can help us survive in a world with so many different things happening, so that when we see something with wheels and metal on it and it's going down the road, that thing that we call a car, right? So we can say car, that's category. We don't have to, every time we see a new one, oh, what's that now? That's something different. It's a different color. So that's what our brains do to help us survive. When we start doing that with people, that's when it becomes problematic, because our brains are going to take the easiest information that we can access. How we look, what people sound like, how they make us feel, those are all readily accessible pieces of information. What's harder are the things that Teresa and I are talking about, that context from which they came.
For me, an example, when I think about this, I think about maybe a client who has a specific race assigned to them. We assume that they grew up practicing stereotypical, maybe cultural aspects of that race, and that's wrong. We can't assume that. And we're not doing them any favors by assuming that that's their makeup and where they're coming from. So that's just what I like to think about, if that makes any sense.
It certainly does. I think, too, the unknown and unfamiliar can be unsettling and even scary. And this goes to the most basic parts of our brain, people. Totally survival mechanism. Because when we were living in caves, when we saw something unknown, the chances are it would eat us or kill us, right? So we need to be scared of things that are, or it makes sense that we're scared of things that are unfamiliar. It's what keeps us, or kept us, alive. But even knowing that's our knee-jerk reaction can be helpful for us. And I think this one is really important too. This goes to the saying, you don't know what you don't know. Perhaps those assuming are not aware that their own worldview may be different than the other. That's sort of what I was getting at that video. Like, there was a lot of assumption happening there about streets and blocks, and the questioner had no idea that they were coming from a very different place from the listener. And this is important to know too, because we all make assumptions about people, is that they're not often made with hurtful intent, not at all. But it doesn't lessen the effect on the person who the assumption is made about. I have a really powerful story surrounding this, and it's something that stuck with me and that I remember and take into my practice. So my parents were both very different religions when I was growing up. They did something extraordinary, though, with that, rather than ignoring it, or rather than, cutting down one another's religion, as sometimes happens. What they did was they embraced it, and they tried to expose both my brother and I to the different practices and beliefs of one another's religion. So as I was sitting at the place of worship for my father's religion, I was sitting alone, and I was pretty uncomfortable, because oftentimes was uncomfortable to sort of be straddling these two worlds. This kindly old lady came and sat next to me, and she sort of pats my hand, and she says, living in a split household must be so difficult. And my heart, for a minute, sort of soared. I was like, oh my goodness, she understands. This is a person outside of my family, and she understands what's going on. And then she followed that with, gosh, your mother must not care what you do. She must not have rules for you. She must let you watch whatever movies you want. It just must be so hard to live with someone like that. So I stared into my lap, and my 35-year-old self would have wanted to punch her in the face. My 9-year-old self was completely confused and crushed, and I didn't really know what was going on. It didn't feel good, but here was this adult, this very seemingly nice, supportive, wonderful adult, saying something terrible about another person that I really cared for, my mother, and I really didn't know what to do at that point. And I always go back to that feeling when I think about talking with clients, when I think about asking questions about their parents, or maybe even making statements about their experiences. That silence, that looking to their lap might not be insight, it might not be that client thinking, oh my goodness, she understands me, I'm so glad that she's here. It might be rage. It might be them feeling indignant or incredibly sad or confused based on assumptions that I might have made innocently.
Based on your beliefs.
Right.
That aren't values of other people.
Absolutely. And that woman had no evil intentions. In fact, if she did, it might have made that situation easier. She actually was reaching out to me in that moment, which sort of speaks to the fact that assumptions can limit our knowledge of what might really be true. That's what I was talking about before. Instead of putting a period at the end of that sentence, what about putting a question mark at the end of it? When we make statements or we make assumptions and we don't know their assumptions, or we don't explore if they're assumptions, it stops curiosity in its tracks. Assumptions can damage relationships for sure. I mean, the kids that we bring in have the most difficult time making reciprocal, healthy relationships with adults and peers in their world. This can be a big block to creating that sort of connection, and can lead to mistrust. If the clients that we work for don't trust us, it's really hard to work with them and help them. Which leads to self-awareness, which can be really brutal. I'm sure Teresa's struggling with that as she's in graduate school, as we all do in those moments. It can be an uncomfortable experience because you're asking yourself questions like, who am I? Right?
It's the constant exploring who you are and what you value, what others value.
Right. Looking back into your own histories and thinking about, have you ever experienced others' assumptions? And if you have, what was that effect? What was that emotional effect? What was the behavioral effect? Have I assumed about or stereotyped others? And I can tell you that this is a guaranteed yes for everyone. Right? It happens. It certainly was for me. What groups do I feel uncomfortable working with? This very important question as you're moving into your career here at Northwest Passage. In graduate school, you're asked to do that very specifically. I'm sure you were asked to do that, Teresa. I was asked. I had 3 populations that I thought I could never work with, ever, in my entire life.
And then you find out you love them.
Right.
So.
Right. I chose teenage girls. I chose adult, male, incarcerated individuals, and I chose sex offenders, or people who had engaged in sexual behaviors that got them in trouble. 2 out of 3 of those populations I found myself working with at Northwest Passage. But I think it was important for me to identify that I would have difficulty, because in that identification process, I was working through why I found those populations difficult, or thought I would find them difficult, and my beliefs about both the population of teenage girls and also those boys who have engaged in unhealthy sexual behaviors has changed immensely since I made that list when I was in graduate school.
I think with everything in life, there's an ebb and flow, and it changes as you change and as you grow, and as you find out your assumptions and stereotypes might have been incorrect. So.
Right. And then finally, what groups do I know little about? I think that's an important one. And which takes us to knowledge of other cultures. Now again, we're not going to go through every culture we can possibly think of on this planet and educate you about them. But it is important to gain knowledge of other cultures, because it can allow you to better understand maybe some of the behaviors, beliefs, and values that some of your clients or coworkers might have. You're really working to gain knowledge of various cultures can allow you to identify client strengths, right? Because we may have clients who are very sort of embedded in their cultural experience. And if we can understand that just a little bit, or we can express curiosity about that, we're building a connection with that client. And I think it can also help aid in difference of communication styles and client supports. Different cultures have different sort of norms about what healthy communication is, and it's important to know that, at least in a general sense. And I think Teresa's point of not everyone who looks like they might come from a cultural background means that means anything to them. you know, it may not mean anything at all.
It can be another harmful assumption that
Right.
you are putting them into a box. So.
For instance, I worked with, in the Passage 3 program, it was great because one girl got discharged and another girl came into the program, kind of one right after another, and they both happened to be from the Hmong culture. The first girl was very embedded in her culture. It was very important to her. The second girl really abhorred it. It was not something that she liked. It was something that brought her pain. They had very different experiences of the same cultural background. So it can be important to educate yourself about these different cultural backgrounds and experiences of other people, as long as you use that knowledge in a healthy way. So the healthiest way is to have that knowledge in the back of your head, but have curiosity at the forefront, I think, is really important. So what we did was we added some places where we thought maybe you could if you didn't know where to start. This first book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, is an amazing book. Yes, it talks about Hmong culture specifically, but it's eye-opening, the effect of assumptions or sort of clashing of cultures. And I would highly recommend that one. And it's well written. It's easy to understand.
The second one, The Road Back to Sweetgrass, is one that I added. Linda Grover is a professor at University of Minnesota Duluth, and she often goes around local communities and lectures on this book and a couple of her other books. And it's talking directly about Native American culture and reservation culture, and then the transition between navigating a white culture, Native American culture. And I think this really applies to this area, the geographical clients that we see.
So these are two very direct books and maybe a little academic in some places and storytelling in others. I wanted to recommend two authors, Amy Tan and Toni Morrison, if you wanted to get at it in a more fun way or more entertaining way. Amy Tan talks a lot about Asian culture and sort of that, again, the meeting of two different cultures in the United States. Toni Morrison talks more about the African American experience. The last author here, now that's more academic, Salvador Minuchin. I love him. He really talks about working with families of the poor. I think he has a great sort of grasp, and his own life is amazing as well. So I would recommend any of his books, but know that those are going to be a little bit more academic and definitely focused on therapy aspects. In terms of entertainment value, again, I listed a couple of podcasts. I love podcasts. I'm kind of addicted to them. TheMoth.org is great. The Moth it's like a story slam. So it's real people telling real stories about their lives, and they come from everywhere. So it's just interesting to hear about different people's stories, and also will help you listen with a non-assuming ear. On Being as well is a podcast. It's produced by Public Radio. And the person who hosts On Being, Krista Tippett, explores all kinds of sort of experiences of the world, some spirituality, but she looks at, she interviews scientists and all manner of people. And then this last website here, New Way Thinking, is sort of a hit you over the head with the information kind of thing. There are videos, there are things that you can read that are just directly about diversity and directly challenging you to think about things.
And kind of on the same wavelength, these last two, this one's a wealth of knowledge of cultural competence, and this one on diversity. And same thing, links, books, magazines, websites, it's kind of all put together there for you. So if you have questions, you can use those as resources.
So as some final thoughts, step 5 is really working with others with awareness. So walking through the world with this idea of awareness. The first is to be mindful. Something you'll hear a lot about in our Passage programs because it's a part of our dialectical behavioral therapy group approach. But being mindful is really, you're turning your attention both inside and outside, and you're staying in the moment. I think this is a really important thing. Be genuine. You're going to mess up. You're going to put your foot in your mouth. You're going to say things that you wish you hadn't said. But if you're being genuine and you're coming from a place of this is who I am and this is how I walk through the world, it's going to get you so much farther in terms of building relationships, especially with the kids that we work with. If anything, they are masters at ferreting out people who are not genuine.
Absolutely.
For sure. Understand that it's a process. Again, you're going to make mistakes, for sure. And here's a secret that I'll give you about building relationships with the kids that we work with. They don't often get apologized to. This is a population that's often marginalized. People make assumptions all over the place about them. They've been locked up in any manner of institutions. They've been talked about by their friends, by adults in their community. Rare that they'll get a genuine apology from an adult. So if you make a mistake, say you're sorry. And if it's a genuine an apology, that's going to work wonders in terms of building that relationship. Again, like we talked about before, you're going to enter each relationship with that balance of knowledge and curiosity. So the knowledge is going to be in the background, the curiosity is going to be in the forefront. And always, because I do a lot of supervision, I'm going to say ask for feedback, ask for help, ask for time with your supervisor, a therapist. All of our therapists in all of our programs are more than happy to spend time with you if you're struggling, especially in a relationship with a kid or some other mentor that you have at Northwest Passage. And these are just the references from our presentation today. Again, other sources of information for you. With that concludes our cultural competency diversity training.